Hello, how is everybody doing? So today we are reading part 3 of The Prince and the Pauper, and tomorrow we'll resume back to our usual 2 to 4 schedule. But in the meantime, hang on, let me check that it closed. Okay, there we go. And I apologize for all of my stammering over all this speech. It is pretty tricky stuff. Oh, I'm going to put in my earbuds so I can hear. Sorry about that. All right. Yeah, it is pretty tongue-twistery. We'll see how I do today. The dinner hour drew near. Oh, sorry about this. Chapter 16, The State Dinner. The dinner hour drew near, yet strangely enough, the thought brought but slight discomfort to Tom, and hardly any terror. The morning's experiences had wonderfully built up his confidence. The poor little ash-cat was already more wonted to his strange garret. After 4 days' habit than a mature person could have become in a full month. A child's facility in accommodating itself to circumstances was never more strikingly illustrated. Let us privileged ones hurry to the great banqueting room and have a glance at matters there whilst Tom is being made ready for the imposing occasion. It is a spacious apartment with gilded pillars and plasters and pictured walls and ceilings. At the door stand tall guards, as rigid as statues, dressed in rich and picturesque costumes and bearing halberds. In a high gallery which runs all around the place is a band of musicians and a packed company of citizens of both sexes in brilliant attire. In the center of the room, upon a raised platform, is Tom's table. Now let the ancient chronicler speak. A gentleman enters the room bearing a rod, and along with him another bearing a tablecloth, which, after they have both kneeled 3 times with the utmost veneration, he spreads upon the table, and after kneeling again they both retire. Then come 2 others, one with the rod again, the other with a salt cellar, a plate, and bread. When they have kneeled as the others have done, and placed what was brought upon the table, they too retire with the same ceremonies performed by the first. At last come 2 nobles, richly clothed, one bearing a tasting knife, who, after prostrating themselves 3 times in the most gracious manner, approached and rubbed the table with bread and salt, with as much awe as if the king had been present. So end the solemn preliminaries. Now, far down the echoing corridors, we hear a bugle blast, and the distinct cry, "Place for the king! Way for the king's most excellent majesty!" These sounds are momentarily repeated. They grow nearer and nearer, and presently, almost in our faces, the martial note peals, and the cry rings out, "Way for the king!" At this instant the shining pageant appears, and files in at the door with a measured march. But the chronicler speaks again. "First come gentlemen, barons, earls, knights of the garter, all richly dressed and bareheaded. Come next the chancellor between 2, one of which carries the royal scepter, the other the sword of state in a red scabbard, studded with golden fleur-de-lis, the point upwards. Next comes the king himself, whom upon his appearing 12 trumpets and many drums salute with a great burst of welcome, whilst all in the galleries rise in their places, crying, 'God save the king!' After him come nobles attached to his person, and on his right and left march his guards of honor, his 50 gentlemen pensioners with gilt battle-axes." This was all fine and pleasant. Tom's pulse beat high, and a glad light was in his eye. He bore himself right gracefully, and all the more so because he was not thinking of how he was doing it. his mind being charmed and occupied with the blithe sights and sounds upon him. And besides, nobody can be very ungraceful in nicely fitting beautiful clothes after he has grown a little used to them, especially if he is for the moment unconscious of them. Tom remembered his instructions, and acknowledged his greeting with a slight inclination of his plumed head, and a courteous, "I thank ye, my good people." He seated himself at table, without removing his cap, and did it without the least embarrassment, for to eat with one's cap on was the one solitary royal custom upon which the king and the Canties met upon common ground, neither party having any advantage over the other in the matter of old familiarity with it. The pageant broke up and grouped itself picturesquely, and remained bareheaded. Now to the sound of gay music the yeomen of the guard entered, the tallest and mightiest men in England, they being carefully selected in this regard. But we will let the chronicler tell about it. The yeomen of the guard entered, bareheaded, clothed in scarlet, with golden roses upon their backs, and these went and came, bringing in each turn a course of dishes served in plate. These dishes were received by a gentleman in the same order they had been brought, and placed upon the table, while the taster gave to each guard a mouthful to eat of the particular dish he had brought, for fear of any poison. Tom made a good dinner, notwithstanding he was conscious that hundreds of eyes followed each morsel to his mouth, and watched him eat it with an interest which could not have been more intense if it had been a deadly explosive, and was expected to blow him up and scatter him all about the place. He was careful not to hurry, and equally careful not to do anything whatever for himself, but wait till the proper official knelt down and did it for him. He got through without a mistake, flawless and precious triumph. When the meal was over at last, he marched away in the midst of his bright pageant, with the happy noises in his ears of blaring bugles, rolling drums, and thundering acclamations. He felt that if he had seen the worst of dining in public, it was an ordeal which would be glad to endure several times a day, if by that means he could but buy himself free from some of the more formidable requirements of his royal office. Chapter 17. Foo-Foo the First. Miles Hendon hurried along toward the Southwark end of the bridge, keeping a sharp lookout for the persons he sought, and hoping and expecting to overtake them presently. He was disappointed in this, however. By asking questions, he was enabled to track them part of the way through Southwark. Then all traces ceased, and he was perplexed as to how to proceed. Still, he continued his effort as best he could during the rest of the day. Nightfall found him leg-weary, half-famished, and his desire as far from accomplishment as ever. So he supped at the Tabard Inn and went to bed, resolved to make an early start in the morning, and gave the town an exhaustive search. As he lay thinking and planning, he presently began to reason thus. The boy would escape from the ruffian, his reputed father. If possible, would he go back to London and seek his former haunts? No, he would never do that. He would avoid recapture. What then would he do? Never having had a friend in the world, or a protector, until he met Miles Hendon, would he naturally try to find that friend again, provided the effort did not require him to go toward London in danger? He would strike for Hendon Hall. That is what he would do, for he knew Hendon was homeward bound, and there he might expect to find him. Yes, the case was plain to Hendon. He must lose no more time in Southwark, but move at once through Kent toward Monk's Holm, searching the wood and inquiring as he went. Let us return to the vanished little king now. The ruffian whom the waiter at the inn on the bridge saw about to join the youth and the king did not exactly join him, but fell in close behind them and followed their steps. He said nothing. His left arm was in a sling, and he wore a large green patch over his left eye. He limped slightly, and used an oaken staff as a support. The youth led the king a crooked course through Southwark, and by struck into the high road beyond. The king was irritated now, and said he would stop here. It was Hendon's place to come to him, not his to go to Hendon. He would not endure such insolence. He would stop where he was. The youth said, "Thou'lt tarry here and thy friend lying wounded in the wood yonder? So be it then." The king's manner changed at once. He cried out, "Wounded? And who hath dared to do it? But that is apart. Lead on, lead on! Faster, sirrah! Art shod with lead? Wounded is he? Now through the doer of it be a duke's son, he shall rue it." It was some distance to the wood, but the space was speedily traversed. The youth looked upon him, discovered a bough sticking in the ground, with a small bit of rag tied to it, then led the way into the forest, watching for familiar boughs and finding them at intervals. They were evidently guides to the point he was aiming at. By and by an open place was reached, where were the charred remains of a farmhouse, and near them a barn which was falling to ruin and decay. There was no sign of life anywhere, and utter silence prevailed. The youth entered the barn. The king followed eagerly upon his heels. No one there. The king shot a surprised and suspicious glance at the youth and asked, "Where is he?" A mocking laugh was his answer. The king was in a rage in a moment. He seized a billet of wood, and was in the act of charging upon the youth when another mocking laugh fell upon his ear. It was from the lame ruffian who had been following at a distance. The king turned and said angrily, "Who art thou? Why is thy business here?" "Leave the foolery," said the man, "and quiet thyself. My disguise is none so good thou canst pretend thou knowest not thy father through it." John Canty replied, there we go. "Thou art not my father. I know thee not. I am the king. If thou hast bid my servant find him for me, and thou shalt sup to sorrow for what thou hast done." John Canty replied in a stern and measured voice, "It is plain thou art mad, and I am loath to punish thee, but if thou provoke me, I must. Thy prattling doth no harm here, where there are no ears that need to mind thy follies, yet as well to practise thy tongue to wary speech, and it may do no hurt when our quarters change. I have done a murder, and may not tarry at home. Neither shalt thou, seeing I need thy service. My name is changed, for wise reasons. It is Hobbs, John Hobbs. Thine is Jack. Change thy memory accordingly. Now then, speak. Where is thy mother? Where are thy sisters?" Hang on. "They came not to the place appointed. Knowst thou whither they went?" The king answered sullenly, "Troubles me not with these riddles. My mother is dead. My sisters are in the palace." The youth near by burst into a derisive laugh, and the king would have assaulted him, but Canty, or Hobbs, as he now called himself, prevented him, and said, "Peace, Hugo, vex him not. His mind is astray, and thy ways fret him. Sit thee down, Jack, and quiet thyself. Thou shalt have a morsel to eat anon." Hobbs and Hugo fell to talking together in low voices, and the king removed himself as far as he could from their disagreeable company. He withdrew into the twilight of the further end of the barn, where he found the earthen floor bedded a foot down with straw. He lay down there, drew straw over himself in lieu of blankets, and was soon absorbed in thinkings. He had many griefs, but the minor ones were swept almost into forgetfulness by the supreme one, the loss of his father. To the rest of the world, the name of Henry VIII brought a shiver, and suggested an ogre whose nostrils breathed destruction, and whose hand dealt scourgings and death. But to this boy the name brought only sensations of pleasure. The figure it invoked were a countenance that were all gentleness and affection. He called to mind a long succession of loving passages between his father and himself, and dwelt fondly upon them. His unstinted tears attested how deep and real was the grief that possessed his heart. As the afternoon wasted away, the lad, wearied with his troubles, sunk gradually into a tranquil and healing slumber. After a considerable time, he would not tell how long, his senses struggled to a half-consciousness, and as he lay with closed eyes, vaguely wondering where he was and what had been happening, he noted a murmurous sound, the sullen beatings of rain upon the roof. A snug sense of comfort stole over him, which was rudely broken. The next moment, by a chorus of piping cackles and coarse laughter. It startled him disagreeably, and he unmuffled his head to see whence his interrupter proceeded. A grim and unsightly picture met his eyes. A bright fire was burning in the middle of the floor, at the other end of the barn, and around it, lit weirdly upon by the red glare, lolled and sprawled the motliest company of tattered gutter scum and ruffians of both sexes he had ever read or dreamed of. There were huge, stalwart men, brown with exposure, long-haired and clothed in fantastic rags. There were middle-sized youth of truculent countenance, and similarly clad. There were blind mendicants with patched and bandaged eyes, crippled ones with wooden legs and crutches. There was a villain-looking peddler with his pack, a knife grinder, a tinker, and a barber surgeon with the implements of his trades. Some of the female were hardly grown girls, some were of prime, some were old unwrinkled hags, and all were loud, brazen, foul-mouthed, and all soiled and slatternly. There were 3 sore-faced babies. There were a couple of starveling curs with strings upon their necks, whose office was to lead the blind. The night was come. The gang had just finished feasting. An orgy was beginning. The can of liquor was passing from mouth to mouth. A general cry broke forth. A song! A song from the Bat and Dick Dot and Go one. One of the blind men got up and made ready by casting aside the patches that sheltered his excellent eyes, and the pathetic placard which recited the cause of his calamity. Dot and Go one disencumbered himself of his timber leg, and took his place upon sound and healthy limbs beside his fellow rascal. Then they soared out a rollicking ditty, and were reinforced by the whole crew at the end of each stanza in a rousing chorus. By the time the last stanza was reached, the half-drunken enthusiasm had risen to such a pitch that everybody joined in and sang it clear through with the beginning, producing a volume of villainous sounds that made the rafters quake. These were the inspiring words. Being Darkmans then, bow smort and ken, the being coves bings await. Oh, goodness. Bings awast. On chast to trine by Rome coves dine, for his long lib has at last. Binged out beins morts and tour, bing out the Rome vile bine, and tour the cove that cloyed are your duds upon the chats to trine. Oh my goodness, that is a tongue twister. Conversation followed, not in the thieves' dialect of the song, for that was only used to talk when unfriendly ears might be listening. In the course of it appeared that John Hobbs was not altogether a new recruit, but had trained in the gang at some former time. His later history was called for, and when he said he had accidentally killed a man, considerable satisfaction was expressed. When he added that the man was a priest, he was roundly applauded, and had to take a drink with everybody. Old acquaintances welcomed him joyously, and new ones were proud to shake him by the hand. He was asked why he had tarried away so many months. He answered, "London is better than the country, and safer these late years. The laws be but bitter, and so diligently enforced. And I had not had that accident, I had stayed there. I had resolved to stay and never more venture countrywards, but the accident has ended that." He inquired how many persons the gang numbered now. The ruffler, or chief, answered, 25 sturdy budges, bulks, files, caperdodgins, and maunders, counting the dells and doxies and other morts. Most are here, the rest are wandering eastward, and the winter lay. We follow at dawn. I do not see the wen among the honest folk about me. Where may he be? Poor lad, his diet is brimstone now, and over hot for a delicate taste. He was killed in a brawl somewhere about midsummer. I sorta hear that. The Wen was a capable man and brave. Are you gonna come up? Come on. Here you are. Now I have to find myself again. That was he, truly. Black Bess is Dell, as of us yet, but absent on the eastward tramp. A fine lass of fine ways and orderly conduct, none ever seeing her drunk above 4 days in the 7. She was ever strict, I remember it well. A goodly wench and worthy all commendation. Her mother was more free and less particular, troublesome and ugly-tempered beldame, but furnished with a wit above the common. We lost her through it. Her gift of palmistry and other sorts of fortune-telling begot for her at last a witch's name and fame. The law roasted her to death at a slow fire. It did touch me to a sort of tenderness to see the gallant way she met her lot, cursing and reviling all the crowd that gaped and gazed upon her, whilst the flames licked up upwards. Nope, don't drink that. Upward toward her face, and catched her thin locks and crackled about her old grey head. Cursing them, said I. Cursing them? Why, and thou should live 1,000 years, shouldst never hear so masterful a cursing. Alack, her art died with her. There be base and weakling imitations left, but no true blasphemy. The rufflers sighed. The listeners sighed in sympathy. General depression fell upon a company for a moment, for even hardened outcasts like these are not wholly dead to sentiment, but are able to feel a fleeting sense of loss and affliction at wide intervals and under peculiarly flavoring circumstances, as in case like to this, for instance, when genuine and cultured departs and leave no heir. However, deep drink all round soon restored the spirits of the mourners. Have any others of our friends fared hardly? Yeah, asked Hobbs. Some, yes. Particularly newcomers, such as small husbandmen turned shiftless and hungry upon the world because their farms were taken from them to be changed into sheep ranges. They begged and were whipped at the cart's tail, naked from the girdle up, till the blood ran. Then set in the stocks to be pelted. They begged again, were whipped again, and deprived of an ear. They begged a third time, poor devils, what else could they do? They were branded on the cheek with a red-hot iron, then sold for slaves. They ran away, were hunted down, and hanged. 'Tis a brief tale and quickly told. Others of us have fared less hardly. Stand forth, yokel, Burns and Hodge. Show your adornments. These stood up and stripped away some of their rags, exposing their backs crisscrossed with ropey old welts left by the lash. One turned up his hair and showed the place where a left ear had once been. Another showed a brand upon his shoulder, the letter V, and a mutilated ear. The third said, I am yokel, once a farmer and prosperous, with loving wife and kids. Now am I somewhat different in estate and calling, and the wife and kids are gone. Mayhap they are in heaven, mayhap in the other place. But the kindly God be thanked, they bide no more in England. My good old blameless mother strove to earn bread by nursing the sick. One of these died, the doctors knew not how, so my mother was burnt for a witch, whilst my babes looked on and wailed. English law! Up all with your cups, now together and with a cheer. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. Drink to the merciful English law that delivered her from the English hell. Thank you, mates, one and all. I begged from house to house, I and the wife, bearing with us the hungry kids, but it was crime to be hungry in England, so they stripped us and lashed us through 3 towns. Drink ye all again to the merciful English law, for its lash drank deep of my Mary's blood, and its blessed deliverance came quick. She lies there in the potter's field, safe from all harms, and the kids, well, Whilst the law lashed me from town to town, they starved. Drink, lads. Only a drop to the poor kids that never did any creature harm. I begged again, begged for a crust, and got the stalks, and lost an ear. See, here bides the stump. I begged again, and here is the stump of the other to keep me minded of it. And still I begged again, and was sold for a slave. Here on my cheek, under this stain, if I washed it off, ye might see the red S, the branded iron, left there. A slave! Do ye understand that word? An English slave! That is he that stands before ye. I have run from my master, and when I am found, the heavy curse of heaven fall upon the law of the land that hath commanded it. I shall hang. A ringing voice came through the murky air. Thou shalt not, and this day the end of the law is come. All turned and saw the fantastic figure of the little king approaching hurriedly. As it emerged from the light and was clearly revealed, a general explosion of inquiries broke out. Who is it? What is it? Who art thou, mannikin? The boy stood unconfused in the midst of all those surprised and unquestioning eyes, and answered with princely dignity, I am Edward, King of England. A wild burst of laughter followed, partly of derision and partly of delight in the excellence of the joke. The king was stung. He said sharply, Ye mannerless vagrants, is this your recognition of a royal boon I have promised? He said more with angry voice and excited gestures, but it was lost to a whirlwind of laughter and mocking exclamation. John Hobbs made several attempts to make himself heard above the din, and at last succeeded, saying, Mates, he is my son, a dreamer, a fool, and stark mad. Mind him not, he thinketh he is the king. I am the king, said Edward, turning toward him, as thou shalt know to thy cost in good time. Thou hast confessed a murder. Thou shalt swing for it. Thou'lt betray me? Thou? And I get my hands upon thee? Tut, tut, said the burly ruffler, interposing in time to save the king, and emphasizing this surface by knocking Hobbs down with his fist. Hast respect for neither king nor rufflers, and thou insult my presence so again, I'll hang thee up myself. Then he said to his majesty, Thou must take no threats against thy mates, lad, and thou must guard thy tongue from saying evil of them elsewhere. Be king, if it please thy mad humour, but be not harmful in it. Sink the title thou hast uttered. 'Tis treason. We be bad men in some few trifling ways, but none among us are so base as to be traitor to his king. We be loving and loyal hearts in that regard. Note that I speak the truth. Now, all together, long live Edward, King of England! Long live Edward, King of England! The response came with such a thunder gust from the motley crew that the crazy building vibrated to the sound. The little king's face lighted with pleasure for an instant, and he slightly inclined his head and said with grave simplicity, I thank you, my good people. This unexpected result threw the company into convulsions of merriment. When something like quiet was presently come again, the ruffler said firmly, but with an accent of good nature, Drop it, boy, 'tis not wise nor well. Humour thy fancy if thou must, but choose some other title. A tinker shrieked out a suggestion, Foo-Foo the First, King of the Mooncalves. This title took at once. Every throat responded, and a roaring shout went up of Long live Foo-Foo the First, King of the Mooncalves, followed by hootings, catcalls, and peals of laughter. Hail him forth and crown him, robe him, sceptre him, throne him! These and 20 other cries broke out at once, and almost before the poor little victim could draw a breath, he was crowned with a tin basin, robed in a tattered blanket, thrown upon a barrel, and sceptred with the tinker's soldering iron. Then all flung themselves upon their knees about him, and sent up a chorus of ironical wailings and mocking supplications, whilst they swabbed their eyes with their soiled and ragged sleeves and aprons. Be gracious to us, O sweet king! Trample not upon thy beseeching worms, O noble majesty! Pity thy slaves and comfort them with a royal kick. Cheer us and warm us with thy gracious rays, O flaming sun of sovereignty. Sanctify the ground with a touch of thy foot, that we may eat the dirt and be ennobled. Deign to spit upon us, O sire, that our children's children may tell of thy princely condescensions, and be proud and happy thereof. But the humorous tinkerer made the hint of the evening, and carried off the honors. Kneeling, he pretended to kiss the king's foot, and was indignantly spurned, whereupon he went about begging for a rag to paste over the place upon his face where he had been touched by the foot, saying it must be preserved from contact with the vulgar air, and that he should make this fortune by going on the highway and exposing it to view at the rate of 100 shillings a sight. He made himself so killingly funny that he was the envy and admiration of the whole mangy rabble. Tears of shame and indignation stood in the little monarch's eyes, and the thought in his heart, had I offered them a deep wrong, they could not be more cruel. Yet have I proffered naught but to do them a kindness, and it is thus they use me for it. Chapter 18. The Prince with the Tramps. The troop of vagabonds turned out at early dawn, and set forward on their march. There was a lowering sky overhead, sloppy ground underfoot, and a winter chill in the air. All gaiety was gone from the company. Some were sullen and silent, some were irritable and petulant, none were gentle-humored. All were thirsty. The ruffler put Jack in Hugo's charge with some brief instructions, and commanded John Canty to keep away from him, and let him alone. He also warned Hugo not to be too rough with the lad. After a while the weather grew milder, and the cloud lifted somewhat. The troop ceased to shiver, and their spirits began to improve. They grew more and more cheerful, and finally began to chaff each other and insult passengers along the highway. This showed that they were awakening to their appreciation of life and its joys once more. The dread in which their sort was held was apparent in the fact that everybody gave them the road, and they took their ribald insolences meekly, without venturing to talk back. They snatched linen from the hedges occasionally, in full view of the owners, who made no protest, but only seemed grateful that they did not take the hedges too. By and by they invaded a small farmhouse and made themselves at home, while the trembling farmer and his people swept the larder clean to furnish a breakfast for him. They chucked the housewife and her daughters under the chin whilst receiving the food from their hands, and made coarse jests about them, accompanied with insulting epithets and bursts of hoarse laughter. They threw bones and vegetables at the farmer and his sons, kept them dodging all the time, and applauded uproariously when a good hit was made. They ended by buttering the head of one of the daughters, who resented some of her familiarities. When they took up their leave, they threatened to come back and burn the house over the heads of the family if any report of their doings got to the ears of the authorities. About noon, after a long and weary tramp, the gang came to a halt behind a hedge on the outskirts of a considerable village. An hour was allowed for rest. Then the crew scattered themselves abroad to enter the village at different points to ply their various trades. Jack was sent with Hugo. They wandered hither and thither for some time, Hugo watching for opportunities to do a stroke of business, but finding none, so they finally said, "I see naught to steal. It is a paltry place. Wherefore we will beg." "We, forsooth, follow thy trade. It befits thee, but I will not beg." "Thou'lt not beg?" exclaimed Hugo, eyeing the king with surprise. "Prithee, since when hast thou reformed?" "What dost thou mean?" "Mean? Hast thou not begged the streets of London all thy life?" "I? Thou idiot! Spare thy compliments. Thy stock will last the longer. Thy father says thou hast begged all the days. Mayhap he lied. Peradventure you will not even make so bold as to say he lied," scoffed Hugo. Him you call my father. Yes, he lied. Come, play not thy merry game of madman so far, mate. Use it for thy amusement, not thy hurt. And I tell him this, he will scorch thee finely for it. Save thyself the troubles, I will tell him. I like the spirit, I do in truth, but I do not admire thy judgment. Bone-rackings and bastings be plenty now in this life, without going out of one's way to invent them. But a truce to these matters. I believe your father. I doubt not he can lie. I doubt not he doth lie upon occasion, for the best of us do that. But there is no occasion here. A wise man does not waste so good a commodity as lying for naught. But come, sith it is thy humour to give over begging, wherewithal shall we busy ourselves? With robbing kitchens? The king said impatiently, Have done with this folly. You weary me. Hugo replied with temper, Now hark ye, mate. You will not beg, you will not rob. So be it. But I will tell you what you will do. You will play decoy whilst I beg. Refuse, and refuse, and you think you may venture. The king was about to reply contemptuously when Hugo said, interrupting, Peace. Here comes one with a friendly face. Now will I fall down in a fit, when the stranger runs to me, set you up a wail, and fall upon your knees, seeming to weep, then cry out as all the devil of misery were in your belly, and say, Oh, sir, it is my poor afflicted brother, and we be friendless. O God's name, cast through your merciful eyes one pitiful look upon a sick, forsaken, and most miserable wretch. Bestow one little penny out of thy riches upon one smitten of God and ready to perish, and mind you, keep you on wailing, and abate not till we bilk him of a penny, else shall you rue it. Then immediately Hugo began to moan, and roll his eyes, and reel and totter about, and when the stranger was close at hand, down he sprawled before him with a shriek, and began to writhe and wallow in the dirt, in seeming agony. Oh dear, cried the benevolent stranger. Oh, poor soul, how he doth suffer. There, let me help thee up. Oh, noble sir, forbear, and God love you for a princely gentleman, but it giveth me cruel pain to touch me when I am taken so. My brother there will tell you, worship, how I am racked with anguish when these fits be upon me. A penny, dear sir, a penny, to buy a little food, then leave me to my sorrows. A penny, thou shalt have thee, thou hapless creature. And he fumbled in his pocket with nervous haste and got them out. There, poor lad, take them, and most welcome. Now come hither, my boy, and help me carry thy stricken brother to yon house, where— I am not his brother, said the king, interrupting. What, not his brother? Oh, hear him, moaned Hugo, then privately ground his teeth. He denies his own brother, and he with one foot in the grave. Boy, thou art indeed hard of heart, if this is thy brother. For shame! And he's scarcely able to move hand or foot. If he is not thy brother, who is he then? A beggar and a thief. He has got your money and has picked your pocket likewise. And thou wouldst do a healing miracle, lay thy staff over his shoulder, and thrust Providence for the rest. But Hugo did not tarry for the miracle. In a moment he was up and off like the wind, the gentleman following after and raising the cue, and cried lustily as he went. The king, breathing deep gratitude to the heaven for his own release, fled in the opposite direction and did not slacken his pace until he was out of harm's way. He took the first road that offered, and soon put the village behind him. He hurried along as briskly as he could, during several hours, keeping a nervous watch over his shoulder for pursuit, but his fears left him at last, and a grateful sense of security took his place. He recognized now that he was hungry, and also very tired, so he halted at a farmhouse, but when he was able to speak, he was cut short and driven rudely away. His clothes were against him. He wandered on, wounded and indignant, and was resolved to put himself in the way of like treatment no more. But hunger is pride's master, so as the evening drew near, he made an attempt at another farmhouse, but here he fared worse than before, for he was called hard names, and was promised arrest as a vagrant except he moved on promptly. The night came on, chilly and overcast, and still the footsore monarch labored slowly on. He was obliged to keep moving, for every time he sat down to rest, he was soon penetrated to the bone with the cold. All his sensations and experiences as he moved through the solemn gloom and the empty vastness of the night were new and strange to him. At intervals he heard voices approach, pass by, and fade into silence, and as he saw nothing more of the bodies they belonged to than a sort of formless drifting blur, there was something spectral and uncanny about it all that made him shudder. Occasionally he caught the twinkle of a light, always far away, apparently, almost in another world. If he heard the tinkle of a sheep's bell, it was vague, distant, and distinct. The muffling lowing of the herds floated to him on the night wind in vanishing cadences, a mournful sound. Now and then came the complaining howl of a dog over viewless expanses of field and forest. All sounds were remote. They made the little king feel that all life and activity were far removed from him, and that he stood solitary, companionless, in a center of the measureless solitude. He scrambled along through the gruesome fascinations of his new experience, startled occasionally by the soft rustling of dry leaves overhead, so like human whispers they seemed to sound, and by he came suddenly upon the freckled light of a tin lantern near at hand. He stepped back into the shadows and waited. The lantern stood by the open door of the barn. The king waited some time. There was no sound, and nobody stirred. He got so cold standing still, and the hospitable barn looked so enticing, that at last he resolved to risk everything and enter. He startled swiftly and stealthily, and just as he was crossing the threshold, he heard voices behind him. He darted behind a cask within the barn and stooped down. 2 farm laborers came in, bringing the lantern with them, and fell to work, talking meanwhile. Whilst they moved about with the light, the king made good use of his eyes, and took the bearings of what seemed to be good-sized stalls at the further end of the place, proposing to grope his way to it when he should be left to himself. He also noted the position of a pile of horse blankets midway of the route, with the intent of to levy upon them for the service of the Crown of England for one night. By and by the men finished and went away, fastening the door behind them and taking the lantern with them. The shivering king made for the blankets, with as good speed as the darkness would allow, gathering them up, and then groped his way safely to the stall. Of 2 of the blankets he made a bed, then covered himself with the remaining 2. He was a glad monarch now, though the blankets were old and thin, and not quite warm enough, and besides gave out a pungent, horsey odor that was almost suffocatingly powerful. Although the king was hungry and chilly, he was also so tired and so drowsy that these latter influences soon began to get the advantage of the former, and he presently dozed off into a state of semi-consciousness. Then, just as he was on the point of losing himself wholly, he distinctly felt something touch him. He was broad awake in a moment, and gasping for breath. The cold horror of that mysterious touch in the dark almost made his heart stand still. He lay motionless and listened, scarcely breathing. But nothing stirred, and there was no sound. He continued to listen and wait, but during what seemed a long time, but still nothing stirred, and there was no sound. So he began to drop into a drowse once more at last, and all at once he felt that mysterious touch again. It was a grisly thing, this light touch from this noiseless and invisible presence. It made the boy sick with ghostly fears. What should he do? That was the question, but he did not know how to answer it. Should he leave his reasonably comfortable quarters and fly from this inscrutable horror? But fly whither? He could not get out he could not get out of the barn, and the idea of scurrying blindly hither and thither in the dark within the captivity of the four walls, with this phantom gliding after him, and visiting him with that soft, hideous touch upon cheek or shoulder at every turn, was intolerable. But to stay where he was and endure this living death all night, was that better? No. What then was there left to do? Ah, there was but one course. He knew it well. He must put out his hand and find that thing. It was easy to think this, but it was hard to brace himself up to try it. 3 times he stretched his hand a little way out into the dark gingerly, and snatched it back suddenly back with a gasp, not because it had encountered anything, but because he had felt so sure that it was just going to. But the 4th time he groped a little further, and his hand lightly swept against something soft and warm. This petrified him, nearly with fright. His mind was in such a state that he could imagine the thing to be nothing else but a corpse, newly dead and still warm. He thought he would rather die than touch it again, but he thought this false thought because he did not know the immortal strength of human curiosity. In no time his hand was trembling, groping again, against his judgment and without his consent, but groping persistently on just the same. It encountered a bunch of long hair. He shuddered, but followed up the hair, and found what seemed to be a warm rope. Followed up the rope, and found an innocent calf. For the rope was not a rope at all, but the calf's tail. The king was cordially ashamed of himself for having gotten all that fright and misery out of so paltry a matter as a slumbering calf, but he need not have felt so about it, for it was not the calf that frightened him, but a dreadful non-existent something which the calf stood for, and any other boy in those half-superstitious times would have acted and suffered just as he had done. The king was not only delighted to find that the creature was only a calf, but delighted to have the calf's company, for he had been feeling so lonesome and friendless that the company and comradeship of even this humble animal was welcome, and he had been so buffeted, so rudely entreated by his own kind, that it was a real comfort to him to feel that he was at last in the society of a fellow creature that had at last a soft heart and a gentle spirit, whatever loftier attributes might be lacking. So he resolved to waive rank and make friends with the calf. While stroking his sleek, warm back, for it lay near him and within easy reach, it occurred to him that this calf might be utilized in more ways than one. Whereupon he rearranged his head, spreading it down close to the calf. Then he cuddled himself up to the calf's back, drew the covers up over himself and his friend, and in a minute or 2 was as warm and comfortable as he had ever been in the drowsy couches of the royal palace of Westminster. Pleasant thoughts came at once. Life took on a cheerfuller seeming. He was free of the bonds of servitude and crime, free of the companionship of base and brutal outlaws. He was warm. He was sheltered. In a word, he was happy. The night wind was rising. It swept by in fitful gusts that made the old barn quake and rattle. Then its forces died down at intervals and went moaning and wailing around the corners and projections. But it was all music to the king now that he was snug and comfortable. Let it blow and rage, let it batter and bang, let it moan and wail, he minded it not. He only enjoyed it. He merely snuggled the closer to his friend in a luxury of warm contentment, and drifted blissfully out of consciousness into a deep and dreamless sleep that was full of serenity and peace. The distant dogs howled, the melancholy kine complained, and the winds went on raging, whilst furious sheets of rain drove along the roof. But the majesty of England slept on, undisturbed, and the calf did the same. It was being a simple creature, and not easily troubled by storms or embarrassed by sleeping with a king. Chapter 19. The Prince with the Peasants. When the king awoke in the early morning, he found that a but thoughtful rat had crept into the place during the night and made a cozy bed for himself in his bosom. Being disturbed now, it scampered away. The boy smiled and said, "Poor fool, why so fearful? I am as forlorn as thou. 'Twould be a blame in me to hurt the helpless. Who am I forlorn? Oh, goodness. Who am myself so helpless? Moreover, I owe you thanks for a good omen. For when a king is fallen so low as that the very rats do make a bed of him, it surely meaneth that his fortunes be upon the turn, since it is plain he can no longer go." He got up and stepped out of the stall, and just then he heard the sound of children's voices. The barn door opened, and a couple of little girls came in. As soon as they saw him, their talkings and laughing ceased, and they stopped and stood still, gazing at him with strong curiosity. They presently began to whisper together. Then they approached nearer and stopped again to gaze and whisper. By and by they gathered courage and began to discuss him aloud. One said, "He hath a comely face." The other added, "And pretty hair. But is all clothed enow? And how starved he looketh!" They came still nearer, sidling shyly around and about him, examining him minutely from all points, as if he were some strange new kind of animal, but warily and watchfully the while, as if they half feared he might be a sort of animal that would bite upon occasion. Finally they halted before him, holding each other's hands for protection, and took a good satisfying stare with their innocent eyes. Then one of them plucked up all her courage and inquired with honest directness, "Who art thou, boy?" "I am the king," was the grave answer. The children gave a little start, and their eyes spread themselves wide open, and remained so during a speechless half-minute. Then curiosity broke the silence. "The king? What king?" "The King of England." The children looked at each other, then at him, then at each other again, wonderingly, perplexedly. Then one said, "Didst hear him, Marjorie? He saith he is the king. Can that be true?" "How can it be else but true, Prissy? Would he say a lie? For look you, Prissy, and it were not true, it would be a lie. It truly would be. Now think on it. For all things that be not true be lies. Thou canst make naught else out of it." It was a good tight argument, without a leak in it else anywhere, and it left Prissy's half-doubts not a leg to stand on. She considered a moment, then put the king upon his honor with the simple remark, "If thou art truly the king, then I believe thee. I am truly the king." This settled the matter. His Majesty's royalty was accepted without further question or discussion, and the two little girls began at once to inquire into how he came to be where he was, and how he came to be so unreally clad, and whither he was bound, and all about his affairs. It was a mighty relief to him to pour out his troubles where they would not be scoffed at or doubted. So he told his tale with feeling, forgetting even his hunger for a time, and it was received with the deepest and tenderest sympathy by the gentle little maids. But when he got down to his latest experiences, and they learned how long he had been without food, they cut him short and hurried him away to the farmhouse to find breakfast for him. The king was cheerful and happy now, and said to himself, "When I am come to mine own again, I will always honor little children, remembering how that these trusted me and believed in me in my time of trouble, whilst they that were older and thought themselves wiser mocked at me and held me for a liar." The children's mother received the king kindly and was full of pity, for his forlorn condition and apparently crazed intellect touched her womanly heart. She was a widow and rather poor, consequently she had seen trouble enough to enable her feel for the unfortunate. She imagined that the demented boy had wandered away from his friends or keepers, so she tried to find out whence he had come, in order that she might take measures to return him. But all her references to neighboring towns and villages, and all her inquiries in the same line, went for nothing. The boy's face, and his answers too, showed that the things she was talking of were not familiar to him. She spoke earnestly and simply about court matters, and broke down more than once when speaking of the late king, his father. But whenever the conversation changed to baser topics, he lost interest and became silent. The woman was mightily puzzled, but she did not give up. As she proceeded with her cooking, she set herself to contriving devices to surprise the boy into betraying his real secret. She talked about cattle. He showed no concern. But then about sheep, the same result. So her guess that he had been a shepherd boy was an error. She talked about mills, and about weavers, tinkers, smiths, tradesmen of all sorts, and about bedlam, and jails, and charitable retreats. But no matter, she was baffled at all points. Not altogether either, for she argued that she had narrowed the things down to domestic service. Yes, she was sure she was on the right track now. He must have been a house servant. So she led up to that, but the result was discouraging. The subject of sweeping appeared to weary him, fire building to stir him, scrubbing and scouring awoke no enthusiasm. Then the good wife touched, with a perishing hope, and rather as a matter of form, upon the subject of cooking. To her surprise and her vast delight, the king's face lighted at once. Ah, she had hunted him down at last, she thought, and she was right proud, too, of the devious shrewdness and the tact which had accomplished it. Her tired tongue got a chance to rest now, for the king's, inspired by gnawing hunger and the fragrant smells that came from the sputtering pots and pans, turned itself loose and delivered itself up to such an eloquent dissertation upon certain toothsome dishes, that within 3 minutes the woman said to herself, "Of a truth I was right, he hath holpen in the kitchen." Then he broadened his bill of fare and discussed it with such appreciation and animation that the good wife said to herself, "Good lack! How can he know so many dishes, and so fine ones withal? For these belong only upon the tables of the rich and great. Ah, now I see, ragged outcast as he is, he must have served in the palace before his reason went astray. Yes, he must have helped in the very kitchen of the king himself. I will test him." Full of eagerness to prove her sagacity, she told the king to mind the cooking a moment, hinting that he might manufacture an added dish or two if he chose. Then she went out of the room and gave her children a sign to follow her. The king muttered, "Another English king had a commission like to this in a bygone time. It is nothing against my dignity to undertake an office which the great Alfred stooped to assume, but I will try to better serve my trust than he, for he let the cakes burn." The intent was good, but the performance was not answerable to it, for this king, like the other one, soon fell into deep thinkings concerning his vast affairs, and the same calamity resulted. The cookery got burned. The woman returned in time to save the breakfast from entire destruction, and she promptly brought the king out of his dream with a brisk and cordial tongue-lashing. Then, seeing how troubled he was over his violated trust, she softened at once and was all goodness and gentleness toward him. The boy made a hearty and satisfying meal, and was greatly refreshed and gladdened by it. It was a meal which was distinguished by this curious feature, that rank was waived on both sides, yet neither recipient of the favor was aware that it had been extended. The good wife had intended to feed this young tramp with broken victuals in a corner, like any other tramp, or like a dog, but she was so remorseful for the scolding she had given him that she did what she could to atone for it by allowing him to sit at the family table and eat with his betters, on ostensible terms of equality with them. And the king, on his side, was so remorseful for having broken his trust after the family had been so kind to him that he forced himself to atone for it by humbling himself to the family level, instead of requiring the woman and her children to stand and wait upon him while he occupied their table in the solitary estate due his birth and dignity. It does us all good to unbend sometimes. This good woman was made happy all the day long by the applauses which she got out of herself for her magnanimous condescensions to a tramp, and the king was just as self-complacent for his gracious humility towards a humble peasant woman. When breakfast was over, the housewife told the king to wash up the dishes. This command was a staggerer, and for a moment the king came near rebelling, but then he said to himself, Alfred the Great watched the cakes, doubtless he would have washed the dishes too. Therefore I will essay it. He made a sufficiently poor job of it, and to his surprise too, for the cleaning of wooden spoons and trenchers had seemed an easy thing to do. It was a tedious and troublesome piece of work, but he finished it at last. He was becoming impatient to get away on his journey now. However, he was not to lose his thrifty dame's society so easily. She furnished him some little odds and ends of employment, which he got through with after a fair fashion, and with some credit. Then he set him and the little girls to paring some winter apples, but he was so awkward at his service that she retired him from it, and gave him a butcher knife to grind. Afterward she kept him carding wood until he began to think he had laid the good King Alfred about fair enough in the shade of for the present, in the matter of showy menial heroisms that would read picturesquely in storybooks and histories, and so he was half-minded to resign. And when, just after the noonday dinner, the good wife gave him a basket of kittens to drown, he did resign. At least, he was just going to resign, for he felt that he must draw the line somewhere, and it seemed to him that to draw it at kitten drowning was about the right thing, when there was an interruption. The interruption was John Canty, with a peddler's pack on his back, and Hugo. The king discovered these rascals approaching the front gate before they had had a chance to see him, so he said nothing about drawing the line, but took up his basket of kittens and stepped quietly out of the back way without a word. He left the creatures in an outhouse and hurried on into a narrow lane at the rear. Chapter 20. The Prince and the Hermit. The high hedge hid him from the house now, and so, under the impulse of a deadly fright, he let out all his forces and sped towards the house in the distance. He never looked back until he had almost gained the shelter of the forest. Then he turned and descried two figures in the distance. That was sufficient. He did not wait to scan them critically, but hurried on, and never abated his pace till he was far within the twilight depths of the wood. Then he stopped, being persuaded that he was now tolerably safe. He listened intently, but the stillness was profound and solemn, awful even, and depressing to the spirits. At wide intervals his straining ear did detect sounds, but they were so remote and hollow and mysterious that they seemed not to be real sounds, but only the moaning and complaining ghosts of departed ones. So the sounds were yet more dreary than the silence which they interrupted. It was his purpose in the beginning to tarry where he was the rest of the day, but the chill soon invaded his perspiring body, and he was at last obliged to resume movement in order to get warm. He struck straight through the forest, hoping to pierce to a road presently, but he was disappointed in that. He travelled on and on, but the farther he went, the denser the woods became apparently. The gloom began to thicken by and by, and the king realized that the night was coming on. It made him shudder to think of spending it in such an uncanny place. So he tried to hurry faster, but he only made the less speed, for he could not now see well enough to choose his steps judiciously, and consequently he kept tripping over roots, entangling himself in vines and briars. And now glad he was when at last he caught the glimmer of a light. He approached it warily, stopped often to look about him and listen. It came from an unglazed window opening in a shabby little hut. He heard a voice now, and felt a disposition to run and hide, but he changed his mind at once, for this voice was praying, evidently. He glided to the one window of the hut, raised himself on tiptoe, and stole a glance within. The room was small. Its floor was the natural earth, beaten hard to use. In a corner was a bed of rushes and a ragged blanket or two. Near it was a pail, a cup, a basin, and 2 or 3 pots and pans. There was a short bench and a 3-legged stool. On the hearth the remains of a faggot fire were smoldering. Before a shrine, which was lighted by a single candle, knelt an aged man, and on an old wooden box at his side lay an open book and a human skull. The man was of large bony frame. His hair and whiskers were very long and snowy white. He was clothed in a robe of sheepskins, which reached from his neck to his heels. "A holy hermit," said the king to himself. "Now am I indeed fortunate." The hermit rose from his knees. The king knocked. A deep voice responded, "Enter, but leave sin behind, for the ground whereon thou shalt stand is holy." The king entered and paused. The hermit turned a pair of gleaming, unrestful eyes upon him and said, "Who art thou?" "I am the king," came the answer with placid simplicity. "Welcome, king," cried the hermit with enthusiasm. Then, bustling about with feverish activity and constantly saying, "Welcome, welcome," he arranged his bench, seated the king on it by the hearth, threw some faggots on the fire, and finally fell to pacing the floor with a nervous stride. "Welcome! Many have sought sanctuary here, but they were not worthy and were turned away. But a king who casts his crown away and despises the vain splendors of his office and clothes his body in rags to devote his life to holiness and the mortifications of the flesh, he is worthy, he is welcome. Here shall he abide all his days till death come." The king hastened to interrupt and explain, but the hermit paid no attention to him, did not even hear him apparently, but went right on with his talk, with a raised voice and a growing energy. "And thou shalt be at peace here. None shall find out thy refuge to disquiet thee with supplications to return to that empty and foolish life which God hath moved thee to abandon. Thou shalt pray here, thou shalt study the book, thou shalt meditate with the follies and delusions of this world, and upon the sublimities of the world to come. Thou shalt feed upon crusts and herbs, and scourge thy body with whips daily to the purifying of thy soul. Thou shalt wear a hair shirt next to thy skin. Thou shalt drink water only, and thou shalt be at peace. Yes, wholly at peace, for whoso comes to seek thee shall go his way again, baffled. He shall not find thee. He shall not molest thee." The old woman the old man, still pacing back and forth, ceased to speak aloud and began to mutter. The king seized this opportunity to state his case, and he did it with an eloquence inspired by uneasiness and apprehension. But the hermit went on muttering and gave no heed. And still muttering, he approached the king and said impressively, "Shh! I will tell you a secret." He bent down to impart it, but checked himself, and amused a little listening attitude. After a moment or two, he went on tiptoe to the window opening, but put his head out and peered around in the gloaming. Then came tiptoeing back again, put his face close down to the king's, and whispered, "I am an archangel." The king started violently and said to himself, Would God I were the outlaws again, for lo, now am I the prisoner of a madman. His apprehensions were heightened, and they showed plainly on his face. In a low, excited voice, the hermit continued, I see you feel my atmosphere. There's awe in your face. None may be in this atmosphere and not be thus affected, for it is the very atmosphere of heaven. I go thither and return in the twinkling of an eye. I was made an archangel on this very spot. It is 5 years ago by angels sent from heaven to confer that awful dignity. Their presence filled this place with an intolerable brightness, and they knelt to me, king. Yes, they knelt to me, for I was greater than they. I have walked in the courts of heaven and held speech with the patriarchs. Touch my hand. Be not afraid. Touch it. There. Now thou hast touched a hand which has been clasped by Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. For I have walked in the golden courts. I have seen the deity face to face. He paused to give his speech effect. Then his face suddenly changed, and he started to his feet again, saying with angry energy, Yes, I am an archangel, a mere archangel, I that might have been pope. It is verily true. I was told it from heaven to a dream 20 years ago. Yes, I was to be pope, and I should have been pope, for heaven had said it. But the king dissolved my religious house, and I, poor, obscure, unfriended monk, was cast homeless upon the world, robed of my mighty dignity. Here he began to mumble again, and beat his forehead in futile rage, and with his fists now and then, and beat his forehead in futile rage with his fist, now and then articulating a venomous curse, and now and then a pathetic, Wherefore I am not but an archangel, I that should have been pope. So he went on for an hour, whilst the poor little king sat and suffered. Then all at once the old man's frenzy departed, and he became all gentleness. His voice softened, and he came down out of the clouds, and fell to a prattling along so simply and so humanly that he soon won the king's heart completely. The old devotee moved the boy nearer to the fire and made him comfortable, doctored his small bruises and abrasions with a deft and tender hand, and then set about preparing the cooking of supper, chatting pleasantly all the time, and occasionally stroking the lad's cheek or patting his head in such a gently caressing way that in a little while all the fear and repulsion inspired by the archangel were charged to reverence and affection for the man. This happy state of things continued while the two ate the supper. Then, after the prayer before the shrine, the hermit put the boy to bed in a small adjoining room, tucking him in as snugly and lovingly as a mother might, and so, with a parting caress, left him and sat down by the fire and began to poke the brands about in an absent and aimless way. Presently he paused, then tapped his forehead several times with his fingers, as if trying to recall some thought which had escaped his mind. Apparently he was unsuccessful. Now he started quickly up, and entered his guest's room, and said, "Thou art king?" "Yes," was the response, drowsily uttered. "Of what king?" "Of England." "Of England! Then Henry is gone." "Alack, it is so. I am his son." A black frown settled down upon the hermit's face, and he clenched his bony hands with a vindictive manner. He stood a few moments, breathing fast and swallowing repeatedly, then said in a husky voice, "Dost know it was he that turned us out into the world, houseless and homeless?" There was no response. The old man bent down and scanned the boy's reposeful face, and listened to his placid breathing. "He sleeps soundly." And the frown vanished away and gave place to an expression of evil satisfaction. A smile flitted across the dreaming boy's features. The hermit muttered, "So, his heart is happy." And he returned away. He went stealthily about the place, seeking here and there for something, now and then halting to listen, now and then jerking his head around and casting a quick glance toward the bed, and always muttering to himself. At last he found what he seemed to want, a rusty old butcher knife and a whetstone. Then he crept to his place by the fire, sat himself down, and began to whet the knife softly on the stone, still muttering, mumbling, ejaculating. The winds sighed around the lonely place, that mysterious voices of the night floated out by the distances. The shining eyes of venturesome mice and rats peered out at the old man from cracks and coverts, but he went on with his work, rapt, absorbed, and noted none of these things. At long intervals he drew his thumb along the edge of his knife, and nodded his head with satisfaction. "It grows sharper," he said. "Yes, it grows sharper." He took no note of the flight of time, but worked tranquilly on, entertaining himself with his thoughts, which broke out occasionally in articulated speech. "His father wrought us evil, he destroyed us, and is gone down into the eternal flames. Yes, down into the eternal flames. He escaped us, but it was God's will. Yes, it was God's will. We must not repine. But he hath not escaped the fires. No, he hath not escaped the fires, the consuming, unpitying, remorseless fires, and they are everlasting." And so he wrought, and still wrought, mumbling, chuckling a low, rasping chuckle at times, and at times breaking again into words. "It was his father that did it. I am an archangel, but for him I should be pope." The king stirred. The hermit sprang noiselessly to the bedside, and went down upon his knees, bending over the prostrate form with his knife uplifted. The boy stirred again. His eyes came open for an instant, but there was no speculation in them. They saw nothing. The next moment his tranquil breathing showed that his sleep was sound once more. The hermit watched and listened for a time, keeping his position and scarcely breathing. Then he slowly lowered his arm, and presently crept away, saying, "It is long past midnight. It is not best that he should cry out, lest by accident someone be passing." Hang on a second, I'm going to close this. He glided about his hovel, gathering a rag here, a thong there, and another one yonder. Then he returned, and by careful and gentle handling, he managed to tie the king's ankles together without waking him. Next, he essayed to tie the wrists. He made several attempts to cross them, but the boy always drew one hand or the other away, just as the cord was ready to be applied. But at last, when the archangel was about ready to despair, the boy crossed his hands himself, and the next moment they were bound. Now a bandage was passed under the sleeper's chin, and brought up over his head, and tied fast, and so softly, so gradually, and so deftly were the knots drawn together, and compacted, that the boy slept peacefully through it all without stirring. Chapter 21. Hendon to the rescue. The old man glided away, stooping stealthily, cat-like, and brought the low bench. He seated himself upon it, half his body to the dim and flickering light, and the other half in shadow, and so, with his craving eyes bent upon the slumbering boy, he kept his patient vigil there, heedless of the drift of time, and softly whetting his knife, and mumbled and chuckled, and in aspect and attitude he resembled nothing so much as a grisly, monstrous spider gloating over some hapless insect that lay bound and helpless in his web. After a long while, the old man, who was still gazing, yet not seeing, his mind having settled into a dreamy abstraction, observed on a sudden that the boy's eyes were open, wide open, and staring up in frozen horror at the knife. The smile of a gratified devil crept over the old man's face, and he said, without changing his attitude or his occupation, "Son of Henry the VIII, hast thou prayed?" The boy struggled helplessly in his bonds, and at the same time forced a smothered sound through his closed jaws, which the hermit chose to interpret as an affirmative answer to his question. "Then pray again! Pray the prayer for the dying!" A shudder shook the boy's frame, and his face blanched. Then he struggled again to free himself, turning and twisting himself this way and that, tugging frantically, fiercely, desperately, but uselessly, to burst his fetters, and all the while the old ogre smiled down upon him, and nodded his head, and placidly whetting his knife, mumbling from time to time, "The moments are precious, they are few and precious, pray the prayer of the dying." The boy uttered a despairing groan and ceased from his struggles, panting. The tears came then and trickled, one after the other, down his face. But his piteous sight wrought no softening effect upon the savage old man. The dawn was coming now. The hermit observed it, and spoke up sharply, with a touch of nervous apprehension in his voice. "I may not indulge this ecstasy longer. The night is already gone. It seems but a moment, only a moment. Would it be enduring a year? Seed of the church's spoiler, close thy perishing eyes, and thou fearest to look upon." The rest was lost in an articulate muttering. The old man snuck upon his knees, his knife in his hand, and bent himself over the moaning boy. Hark! There was a sound of voices near the cabin. The knife dropped from the hermit's hand. He cast a sheepskin over the boy, and started up, trembling. The sounds increased, and presently the voices became rough and angry. Then came blows, and cries for help. Then a clatter of swift footsteps retreating. Immediately came a succession of thundering knocks upon the cabin door, followed by, "Hello! Open, and dispatch in the name of all the devils!" Oh, this was the blessedest sound that had ever made music in the king's ears, for it was Miles Hendon's voice. The hermit, grinding his teeth in impotent rage, moved swiftly out of the bedchamber, closing the door behind him, and straightway the king heard a talk to this effect proceeding from the chapel. "Homage and greetings, reverend sir. Where is the boy? My boy." "What boy, friend? What boy? Lie me no lies, sir priest. Play me no deceptions. I am not in the humour for it. Near to this place I caught the scoundrel who I judged did steal him from me, and I made them confess. They said he was at large again, and they had tracked him to your door. They showed me his very footsteps. Now palter no more, for look you, holy sir, and thou produce him not. Where is the boy?" "Good sir, peradventure you mean the ragged regal vagrant that tarried here the night. If such as you take interest in such as he, know, then, that I have sent him on an errand. He will be back soon." "How soon? How soon? Come, waste not the time. Cannot I overtake him? How soon will he be back?" "Thou needst not, sir. He will return quickly." "So be it then. I will try to wait. But stop! You sent him on an errand? You? Verily, this is a lie. He would not go. He would pull thy old beard, and thou didst offer him such an insolence. Thou hast lied, friend. Thou hast surely lied. He would not go for thee, nor any other man." "For any man? Oh, haply not. But I am not a man." "What? Now, a God's name, what art thou then?" "It is a secret. Mark thou reveal it not. I am an archangel." It was a tremendous ejaculation from Miles Hendon, not altogether unprofane, followed by, "Thou doth well and truly account for his complaisance. Right well I knew he would budge nor hand nor foot in the menial service of any mortal. But Lord, even a king must obey when an archangel gives the word or command. Let me, shh! What noise was that?" All this while the little king had been yonder, alternately quaking with terror and trembling with hope, and all the while, too, he had thrown all the strength he could into his anguished moanings. constantly expecting them to reach Hendon's ears, but always realizing with bitterness that they failed, or at least made no impression. So this last remark was of his servant came as comes So this last remark of his servant came as comes a reviving breath from fresh fields to the dying. He was exerted himself once more, and with all his energy, just as the hermit was saying, "Noise! I heard only wind." Mayhaps it was, but doubtless that was it. I have been hearing it faintly all the... There it is again! It is not the wind. What an odd sound. Come, we will hunt it out. Now the king's joy was newly insupportable. His tired lungs did their utmost, and hopefully too, but the sealed jaws and the muffling sheepskin sadly crippled the effort. Then the poor fellow's heart sank to hear the hermit say, "I came from without, I think from the copse yonder. Come, I will lead the way." The king heard the two pass out, talking, heard their footsteps die quickly away. Then he was alone with a boding, brooding, awful silence. It seemed an age till he heard the steps and voices approaching again, and this time he heard an added sound, the tramping of hoofs apparently. Then he heard Hendon say, "I will not wait longer. I cannot wait longer. He has lost his way in this thick wood. Which direction took he? Quick, point it out to me." But wait, I will go with thee." "Good, good. Why truly thou art better than thy looks. Marry, I do think there's not another archangel with so right a heart as thine. Wilt ride? Wilt take the wee donkey that's for my boy? Or wilt thou fork thy holy legs over this ill-conditioned slave of a mule that I have provided for myself, and had been cheated in, too, had he cost but the indifferent sum of a month's usury of a brass farthing let to a tinker out of work? No, ride thy mule, and lead thine ass. I am sure of mine own feet, and will walk. Then prithee mind the little beast for me, while I take my life in my hands, and make what success I may toward mounting the big one." Then followed a confusion of kicks, cuffs, tramplings, and plungings, accompanied by a thunderous intermingling of volleying curses, and finally a bitter apostrophe to the mule, which must have broken its spirit, for hostilities seemed to cease from that moment. With unutterable misery, the fettered little king heard the voices and footsteps fade away and die out. All hope forsook him now for the moment, and the dull despair settled down upon his heart. "My only friend is deceived and got rid of," he said. "The hermit will return, and—" he finished with a gasp, and at once fell to struggling so frantically with its bonds again that he shook open the smothering sheepskin. And now he heard the door again. The sound chilled him from the marrow. Already he seemed to feel the knife at his throat. Horror made him close his eyes. Horror made him open them again, and before him stood John Canty and Hugo. He would have said, thank God, if his jaws had been free. A moment or two later his limbs were at liberty, and his captors, each gripping him by the arm, were hurrying him with all speed through the forest. Chapter 22. A Victim of Treachery. Once more King Fu-Fu the First was roving with the tramps and outlaws, a butt for some coarse jests and dull-witted railleries, and sometimes the victim of small spitefulness at the hands of Canty and Hugo, when the ruffler back was turned. None but Canty and Hugo really disliked him. Some of the others liked him, and all admired his pluck and spirit. During 2 or 3 days, Hugo was in whose ward and charge the king was, did what he covertly could to make the boy uncomfortable, and at night, during the customary orgies, he assumed company by putting small indignities upon him, always as if by accident. Twice he stepped upon the king's toes, accidentally, and the king, as became his royalty, was contemptuously unconscious of it, and was indifferent to it. But the third time Hugo entertained himself in that way, the king felled him to the ground with a cudgel, to the prodigious delight of the tribe. Hugo, consumed with anger and shame, sprang up, seized a cudgel, and came at his small adversary in a fury. Instantly a ring was formed around the gladiators, and the betting and cheering began. But poor Hugo stood no chance whatever. His frantic and lubberly prentice work found but a poor market for itself when pitted against an arm which had been trained by the first masters of Europe in single-stick, quarterstaff, and every art and trick of swordmanship. The little king stood, alert but at graceful ease, and caught and turned aside the thick rain of blows with a facility and precision which set the motley onlookers wild with admiration, and every now and then, when his practised eye detected an opening, and a lightning swift rap upon Hugo's head followed as a result, the storm of cheers and laughter that swept the place was something wonderful to hear. At the end of 15 minutes, Hugo, all battered, bruised, and the target of a pitiless bombardment of ridicule, slunk from the field, and the unscathed hero of the fight was seized and borne aloft upon the shoulders in the joyous rabble to the place of honor beside the ruffler, where with vast ceremony he was crowned king of the gamecocks, his meaner title being at the same time solemnly cancelled and annulled, and a decree of banishment from the gang pronounced against any who would thenceforth utter it. All attempts to make this king serviceable to the troop had failed. He had stubbornly refused to act. Moreover, he was always trying to escape. He had been thrust into an unwatched kitchen the first day of his return. He not only came forth empty-handed, but tried to rouse the housemaid. He was sent out with a tinker to help him at his work. He would not work. Moreover, he threatened the tinker with his own soldering iron, and finally both Hugo and the tinker found their hands full of the mere matter of keeping him from getting away. He delivered the thunders of his royalty upon the heads of all who hampered his liberties or tried to force him to service. He was sent out in Hugo's charge, in company with a slatternly woman and a diseased baby, to beg, but the result was not encouraging. He declined to plead for the mendicants, or to be party to their cause in any way. Thus several days went by, and the miseries of this tramping life, and the weariness and sordidness and meanness and vulgarity of it, became gradually and steadily so intolerable to the captive that he began at last to feel that his release from the hermit's knife must prove only a temporary respite from death, or at best. But at night, in his dreams, these things were forgotten, and he was on his throne, and master again. This, of course, intensified the sufferings of the awakenings. So the mortifications of each succeeded morning of the few that passed between his return to bondage and the combat with Hugo grew bitterer and bitterer, and harder to bear. The morning after that combat, Hugo got up with a heart filled with vengeful purposes against the king. He had no plans in particular. One was to inflict upon the lad what would be, to his proud spirit and imagined royalty, a peculiar humiliation, and if he failed to accomplish this, his other plan was to put a crime of some kind upon the king, and then betray him into the implacable clutches of the law. In pursuance of the first plan, he proposed to put a climb upon the king's leg, rightly judging that would mortify him to the last, and perfect decree. And as soon as the crime should operate, he meant to get Canty's help, and force the king to expose his leg in the highway, and beg for alms. Climb was the cant term for a sore, artificially created. To make a climb, the operator made a paste or poultice of unslaked lime soap, and the rust of old iron, and spread it upon a piece of leather, which was then bound tightly upon the leg. This would presently fret off the skin, and make the flesh raw and angry looking. Blood was then rubbed into the limb, which, being fully dried, took on a dark and repulsive color. Then a bandage of soiled rags was put on in a cleverly careless way, which would allow the hideous ulcer to be seen and move the compassion of the passer-by. Hugo got the help of the tinker whom the king had cowed with the soldering iron. They took the boy out on a tinkering tramp, and as soon as they were out of sight of the camp, they threw him down, and the tinker held him, while Hugo bound the poultice tight and fast upon his leg. The king raged and stormed, and promised to hang the two the moment the scepter was in his hand again, but they kept firm grip upon him, and enjoyed his impotent struggling, and jeered at his threats. This continued until the poultice began to bite, and in no time its work would have been perfected if there had been no interruption. But there was, for about this time, the slave who had made the speech denouncing England's laws, appeared on the scene, and was put an end to the enterprise, and stripped off the poultice and bandage. The king wanted to borrow his deliverer's cudgel, and warm the jackets of the two rascals on the spot, but the man said no, it would bring the outside world, would not venture to interfere or interrupt. He marched the party back to camp, and reported the affair to the ruffler, who listened, pondering, and then decided that the king should not be again detailed to beg, since it was plain he was worthy of something higher and better. Wherefore, on the spot, he promised him from the mendicant rank, and appointed him to steal. Hugo was overjoyed. He had already tried to make the king steal, and failed. There would be no more trouble of that sort now, for of course the king would not dream of defying the distinct command delivered directly from headquarters. So he planned a raid for that very afternoon, proposing to get the king in the law's grip in the course of it, and to do it, too, with such ingenious strategy that it should seem to be accidental and unintentional, for the king of the gamecocks was popular now, and the gang might not deal over gently with an unpopular member who played so serious a treachery upon him as to deliver him over to the common enemy, the law. Very well, all in good time. Hugo strolled off to the neighboring village with his prey, and the two drifted slowly up and down one street after another, the one watching sharply for a sure chance to achieve his evil purpose, and the other watching as sharply for a chance to dart away and get free of this infamous captivity forever. Both threw away some tolerably fair-looking opportunities, for both, in their hearts, were resolved to make absolutely sure work this time, and neither meant to allow his fevered desires to seduce him into any venture that had much uncertainty about him. Hugo's chance came first, for at last a woman approached who carried a fat package of some sort in a basket. Hugo's eyes sparkled with sinful pleasure as he said to himself, "Breath of my life, and I can but put that upon him. 'Tis good'n, and God keep thee, king of the gamecocks." He waited and watched, presently outwardly patient, but inwardly consuming with excitement, till the woman had passed by, and the time was ripe, then said in a low voice, "Tarry here till I come again," and darted stealthily after the prey. The king's heart was filled with joy. He could make his escape now, if Hugo's quest only carried him far enough away. But he was to have no such luck. Hugo crept behind the woman, snatched the package, and came running back, wrapping it in an old piece of blanket which he carried on his arm. And hue and cry was raised in a moment by the woman, who threw her loss by the lightning of her burden, although she had not seen the pilfering done. Hugo thrust the bundle into the king's hands without halting, saying, "Now speed ye after me with the rest, and cry, 'Stop, thief!' but mind ye lead them astray." The next moment Hugo turned a corner and darted down a crooked alley, and in another moment or two he lounged into view again, looking innocent and indifferent, and took up a position behind a post to watch results. The insulted king threw the bundle on the ground, and the blanket fell away from it just as the woman arrived, with an augmenting crowd at her heels. She seized the king's wrist with one hand, snatched up her bundle with the other, and began to pour out a tirade of abuse upon the boy, while he struggled, without success, to free himself from her grip. Hugo had seen enough. His enemy was captured, and the law would get him now. So he slipped away, jubilant and chuckling, and wended campwards, framing a judicious version of the matter to give to the ruffler's view as he strode along. The king continued to struggle in the woman's strong grasp, and now and then cried out in vexation, "Unhand me! Thou foolish creature, it was not I that bereaved thee of thy paltry goods." The crowd closed around, threatening the king and calling him names. A brawny blacksmith in leather apron and sleeves rolled to his elbows made a reach for him, saying he would trounce him well for a lesson. But just then a long sword flashed in the air and fell with a convincing force upon the man's arm, flat side down, the fantastic owner of it remarking pleasantly at the same time, "Marry, good souls, let us proceed gently, not with ill blood and uncharitable words. This is a matter for the law's consideration, not private and unofficial handling. Loose thy hold from the boy, good wife." The blacksmith averaged the stalwart soldier with a glance. Yeah, that is the right word. Then went muttering away, rubbing his arms. The woman released the boy's wrist reluctantly. The crowd eyed the stranger unlovingly, but prudently closed their mouths. The king sprang to his deliverer's side, with flushed cheeks and sparkling eyes, exclaiming, "Thou hast lagged sorely, but thou comest in good season now, Sir Miles. Carve me this rabble to rags." I think we'll do one, maybe two more chapters, and then we will end the stream. Chapter 23, The Prince a Prisoner. Hendon forced back a smile, and bent down and whispered to the king's ear, "Softly, softly, my prince, wag thy tongue warily. Nay, suffer it not to wag at all. Trust in me, and all shall go well in the end." Then he added to himself, "Sir Miles, bless me, I have totally forgotten I was a knight. Lord, how marvellous a thing it is, the grip his memory doth take upon his quaint and crazy fancies. An empty and foolish title is mine, and yet it is something to have deserved it. For I think it is more honor to be held worthy to a spectre knight in this kingdom of dreams and shadows, than to be held base enough to be an earl in some of the real kingdoms of this world." The crowd fell apart to admit a constable, who approached and was about to lay his hand upon the king's shoulder, when Hendon said, "Gently, good friend, withhold your hand. He shall go peaceably. I am responsible for that. Lead on, we will follow." The officer led, with the woman and her bundle. Miles and the king followed after, with a crowd at their heels. The king was inclined to rebel, but Hendon said to him in a low voice, "Reflect, sire. Your laws are the wholesome breath of your own royalty. Shall their source resist them, yet require the branches to respect them? Apparently one of these laws has to be broken. When the king is on his throne again, can it ever grieve him to remember that when he was seemingly a private person, he loyally slunk the king in the citizen, and submitted to its authority? Thou art right, say no more. Thou shalt see that whatsoever the King of England requires a subject to suffer under the law, he will himself suffer while he holdeth the station of subject." When the woman was called upon to testify before the justice of the peace, she swore that the small prisoner at the bar was the person who had committed the theft. There was none able to show the contrary, so the king stood convicted. The bundle was now unrolled, and when the contents proved to be a plump little dressed pig, the judge looked troubled, whilst Hendon turned pale, and his body was thrilled with an electric shiver of dismay. But the king remained unmoved, protected by his ignorance. The judge meditated, during an ominous pause, then turned to the woman with the question, "What dost thou hold this property to be worth?" The woman courtesied and replied, 3 shillings and 8 pence, your worship. I could not abate a penny and set forth the value honestly. The justice glanced about uncomfortably upon the crowd, then nodded to the constable and said, "Clear the court and close the doors." It was done. None remained but the 2 officials the accuser, and Miles Hendon. This latter was rigid and colorless, and on his forehead big drops of cold sweat gathered, broke and blended together, and trickled down his face. The judge turned to the woman again, and said in a compassionate voice, "'Tis a poor ignorant lad, and mayhap was driven hard by hunger, for these be grievous times, for the unfortunate. Mark you, he hath not an evil face, but when hunger driveth, good woman, dost know that when one steals a thing above the value of 13 pence halfpenny, the law saith he shall hang for it." The little king started, wide-eyed with consternation. He but controlled himself and held his peace, but not so the woman. She sprang to her feet, shaking with fright, and cried out, "Oh, good lack, what have I done? God a mercy, I should not hang the poor thing for the whole world. Ah, save me from this, your worship. What shall I do? What can I do?" The justice maintained his judicial composure, and simply said, "Doubtless it is allowable to revise the value, since it is not yet writ upon the record. Then in God's name call the pig 8 pence, and heaven bless the day that freed my conscience of this awesome thing." Miles Hendon forgot all decorum in his delight, and surprised the king and wounded his dignity by throwing his arms around him and hugging him. The woman made her grateful adieu, and started away with her pig, and when the constable opened the door for her, he allowed her out into the narrow hall. The justice proceeded to write in his record book. Hendon, always alert, thought he would like to know why the officer allowed the woman out, so he slipped softly into the dusky hall and listened. He heard a conversation to this effect: "It is a fat pig and promises good eating. I will buy it from thee. Here is the 8 pence. 8 pence indeed! Thou do no such thing. It cost me 3 shillings and 8 pence. Good honest coin for the last reign. That old Harry, that's such a dead, ne'er touched nor tampered with. A fig for thy 8 pence. Stands the wind in that quarter? Thou hast under oath, and so swore falsely, when thou saidst the value was but 8 pence. Come straightway back with me before his worship, answer for the crime, and then the lad will hang. There, dear heart, say no more. I am content. Give me the 8 pence and hold thy peace about the matter." The women went off crying. Hendon slipped back into the courtroom, and the constable presently followed after, hiding his prize in some convenient place. The justice wrote a while longer, then read the king a wise and kindly lecture, and sentenced him to a short imprisonment in the common jail, to be followed by a public flogging. The astounded king opened his mouth, and was probably going to order the good judge to be beheaded on the spot, but he caught a warning sign from Hendon, and succeeded in closing his mouth again before he lost anything out of it. Hendon took him by the hand now, made reverence to the justice, and the two departed in the wake of the constable toward the jail. The moment the street was reached, the inflamed monarch halted, snatched away his hand, and exclaimed, "Idiot! Dost imagine I will enter a common jail alive?" Hendon bent down and said, somewhat sharply, "Will you trust in me? Peace, and forbear to worsen our chances with dangerous speech. What God wills will happen. Thou canst not hurry it. Thou canst not alter it, therefore wait, and be patient. 'Twill be time enow to rail or rejoice when what is to happen has happened. Alright, so we could go another chapter, but I do have an appointment at 4, so I'm going to go ahead and end here for the day. But tomorrow at 2, we're going to return to our regular time. We will finish up The Prince and the Pauper. So thank you very much for joining me. I'll go ahead and end the stream here, and I'll see you tomorrow.